everyone, this video is for the boys. That's right guys, we're gonna talk about dude stuff like sports, red meat, celibacy, fast cars, being twice as likely to die of heart disease, going to the gym, power tools, trucks, a pit of anger and depression, always there, just at the edge of your mind, expanding out and eating away at the margins, swallowing up any brief moments of joy that distract you from the emptiness at the center of who you are, like light being sucked into a black hole. And bacon! It seems like there's a consensus right now that men aren't doing all right. There's been growing attention on the epidemic of male loneliness, with one New York Times article featuring the best headline and illustration combo I've ever seen. I want to get this tattooed on my back. This is part of a general trend I've seen where some people on the left and center have been bringing attention to issues that men, usually young men and boys, face, focusing mainly on loneliness like I just mentioned, as well as difficulty meeting girls on dating apps, lack of achievements in education and the job market, and general atomization in society. For reasons that I'll get into more towards the end of the video, I'm not a huge fan of the response you tend to see on the left from people who I think are very well-meaning, but who seem to think that the issues men face can be solved by like internet micro-celebrities telling guys to just be confident. While I don't think that's bad by any means, I do think that looking at it like that misses some bigger picture issues. Like, you'll see people saying how if we want to prevent young men from getting into Jordan Peterson, we need a Jordan Peterson of our own. And it's like, nah, I think one is more than enough. The only way to stop a bad guy doing Jungian analysis of Pinocchio is with a good guy doing Marxist analysis. But speaking of Jordan Peterson, while I may have some issues with the left-wing response to men's issues, let's take a look at how people who are a bit more conservative are responding.
What is it to be a man's man today? I mean, I grew up wanting to be a man's man. That's what you wanted to be.
So you understand, though, there's a big space, a whole lot of space between a feminized man, which I don't think most women want, and a man who's willing to share vulnerabilities. Okay. There's a big space.
So the definition of vulnerability is weakness. Let's start talking about things in objective terms.
My friends, and we'll be talking about like World War II or some medieval, like the storming of like 1066, Battle of Hastings or something. We're all just like, we wish we could go to some war like that.
Why is enforced monogamy the solution for people that are involuntary celibates?
Well, it's the solution to the relationship between men and women.
Today it's toxic masculinity, right? You're hearing it everywhere.
He goes, "Shut up, bitch," to my mom. And I was like, oh. When I come home, my dad's waiting for me at home. He goes, like, okay, this is what you're gonna do. As soon as you get off the bus tomorrow, you're gonna walk up to Matt. You're gonna punch him in the face. And I punch this kid, I beat the living crap out of him. I'm crying while I'm on top of him the whole time. He comes out and he goes, "Hey, free day off." And he pounds me. We go get ice cream. He takes me to a Yankee game that night.
There's a part of that that's not, that your dad didn't do you wrong, dude. There's a part of that that's kind of like, you know.
People are being canceled for being a man's man.
So that's a lot. So for one thing, someone who I didn't really know about before making this video is Patrick Bet David. He runs a channel called Valuetainment, and first of all, I like how when you Google Valuetainment, the first question that gets pulled up is, who is Valuetainment guy? Like, he's not even the Valuetainment guy. Something else that's very funny about him is that he constantly talks about how being a real man is about hustling and working hard.
Socialist boys have limited options. Capitalist men have unlimited options in every aspect of their life. Where they live, where they travel to, where they eat, who they date, anything you want.
The thing is though, Patrick isn't just Valuetainment guy. He's also the CEO of the PHP agency, a life insurance company that, if we just pull up the breakdown of how much everyone working there makes, yeah, that looks suspiciously pyramid-shaped to me. He actually made a video that's way longer than any of his other content, where he responds to a segment John Oliver did about MLMs, arguing that there's nothing wrong with them.
I investigated the entire industry. MLM, multi-level marketing, is not an industry. It's a philosophy. Out of 100 people in network marketing, you know how many people make it? Is it 50? Is it 40, 30, 20? How many is it? How many people you think make it in network marketing? One make it. In real estate, 87% of real estate agents fail within 5 years. Think about that. How about we go knock real estate? How about we go do videos and knock real estate? Does that mean real estate doesn't work? 3 different things that's very, very easy to target. And you can't be naive and fall for it. One of them is capitalism. It's very easy to bash capitalism. So why is it easy to knock capitalism? Because capitalism at times can, people can fail and it doesn't work and have to bash it. Now let's take capitalism out. You don't have this video to watch. You don't have Twitter. You don't have Facebook. You don't have anything to watch because an inventor invented capitalism. You know how many women I've met that talk about Mary Kay in a way that she changed their lives? Do you know how many? Now another one that media likes to take shots at is church, religion. It's very easy. And network marketing is also an easy target. I think it's a very good thing. These 11 things. Again, I would like John to talk about this a little bit because there is some good in network marketing as well. And here's what it is. Number one, any organization that gets people to read books, I'm all for it.
But also, interestingly, he doesn't bring up his company at all. Yeah, just a casual defense of an unbelievably unethical industry. No reason, though. What's that? My business is also an MLM? I didn't even realize. That's so random. It is, of course, no surprise that this guy runs an MLM, though. Like, I can smell his cologne through the screen. It'd be shocking if he didn't run one. That'd be like finding out that Justin Trudeau had never heard of tantric yoga. Like, oh my god, dude, check it out. It's going to become your entire personality. But Patrick brings this same grifty vibe to his videos about masculinity, even when he's giving completely normal and innocuous advice. It all still feels like he's also trying to overcharge you on a used Ford Focus.
Be impressed by the right things that matter. A lot of times people will be impressed by the wrong things. Oh, this guy's got nice jewelry. This guy's got nice this guy's got nice cars. This guy's got nice that. Don't get me wrong, I like the Ferrari. I like the Lambo, the Rolls Royce. I've had all those exotics. I like all of those things.
But the funniest thing is for sure when he's talking about the fall of strong men. First of all, I love how literal his brain is. Like, when he says that men are weak now, he literally just means that they can't lift as much.
Years ago, you had to learn how to hunt to get your food. Today, you just call Uber Eats. Lots changed. Are men becoming pansies? Are they becoming soft? Are we becoming passive? Like, oh my gosh, betas? Is that what's happening? I got a bunch of data I want to talk to you about that has to do with what we bench pressed 30 years ago versus today. Squat, our grip strength.
But also, what's interesting about this to me is that when you look into it, Patrick actually is very much in line with the people who defined what it meant to be a man in past generations. By which I mean that masculinity has kind of always been a con. And so, in this video, we're going to talk about the history of crises of masculinity in America. Okay, here's some quick housekeeping off the top. People always get upset when I make these kinds of disclaimers. If that's you, shut up. So, I'm gonna be going through a history of masculinity in America, but something I should say is that this is gonna be focused on straight, white, cis, middle-class men. Finally, some representation. This is, for one thing, because that's generally the group people tend to talk about when they bring up the modern-day crisis in masculinity, and I think there's an important through line here. Also, going into other groups would require multiple videos of their own. I highly recommend learning more about people other than cis-het white guys, and also to send some love over to creators who themselves aren't cis-het white guys. In particular, here's a really good video about the history of trans people by Cops Hate Mo, and also Colormind, who is a criminally underrated channel, recently made a video about black masculinity, so check that out too. Now, let's get into it. So while some people will argue that America has always been spiritually capitalist owing to its individualist Protestant vibe, this tends to feel to me a bit more like fanfic than actual historical or economic analysis. Now, from its founding as a British colony in 1607 until around the turn of the 19th century, while there were some early markets based around things like tobacco, it was mostly an agrarian society based around subsistence farming with heavy community cooperation. Now, the sociologist Michael Kimmel, who, by the way, is one of the foremost people in studying masculinity, and everything he writes fucking rips. I'll be drawing from him a lot in this video. Anyways, Kimmel argues that any economic system also comes with its own form of masculinity. Kimmel argues that during the time when America was largely agrarian, up until around the early to mid-1800s, the two dominant models of masculinity for white men were the genteel patriarch and the heroic artisan. The genteel patriarch was basically the European upper class transplanted to America. He was cultured, sophisticated, while also an extremely doting father. He believed farming was the noblest profession since it meant the greatest amount of independence and could teach a man the values of honor, hard work, and self-reliance. But also, like, in this context, when we say farming, that doesn't mean actually doing any labor, but rather owning the land and people who work it. The heroic artisan, on the other hand, was an actual farmer or craftsman who worked with his hands, was free to apply the skills of his trade on his own terms, and embodied strong republican virtues, which at the time meant things like frugality, hard work, and civil engagement. If TikTok existed back then, the heroic artisan would be the guy that 1810's Andrew Tate would tell you need to become. Men! The hard truth is that you'll never get any pussy unless you can create complex pattern coverlets using mechanical jacquard looms. But then the 1830s began and fucked all that up by introducing longtime foe of the channel, large-scale industrial capitalism. Thanks to a combination of the market revolution, the industrial revolution, the spread of a banking system, and a massive boom in the price of cotton fueling rapid economic development, a ton of Americans were now being pulled away from subsistence work to enter the market. This shift led to the creation of what Kimmel calls market masculinity, or the archetype of the self-made man. Instead of land ownership or craftsmanship, now being a man meant competing in the capitalist market and winning. This did two things. First of all, market masculinity quickly cucked the previous two archetypes. Genteel patriarchs had been on their way out for a while now. Like, dressing like the European aristocracy was a very pre-War of Independence look. They came to be seen as lazy, foppish dandies, which was a pretty fair read, to be honest. This view of them was also pushed by Northern propaganda during the Civil War, showing these effeminate relics of an agrarian, slave-owning South juxtaposed with the Northern industrial self-made men. Unlike the genteel patriarchs who inherited their wealth, the new market men had built their fortunes themselves with the blood, sweat, and tears of their employees. And speaking of, under this new economic system, the heroic artisan was now demoted to proletarian wage cuck working in one of the market man's factories. But something else happened here too. The rise of the self-made man started the first crisis in masculinity. Before this, manliness was something that was intrinsic and couldn't be taken away. Now it was becoming homosocially defined. That is, defined by a man's relationship to other men in the markets. Now, there's a general truism in psychoanalysis that when people lose something in reality, they recreate it in fantasy. Whether it's a loved one, a relationship, or some kind of status, we tend to gather memories and symbols that remind us of what we lost and use them to make a sort of fantasy recreation of it. And as I think you'll see, that's very much the story of masculinity in America, too. So, to deal with their manhoods being thrown into question for the first time, these guys came up with 4 super healthy ways of affirming their gender. Number 1 was the grind. Being a man meant working, and so men went to work. Not only that, but to prove how good and how manly they really were, they made sure to create a nice, uneven playing field by keeping women and minorities out of the workplace. Number 2, they went west, either from England to the New World or to settle the western frontier of America to prove themselves by building barns and killing indigenous people. And speaking of which, number 3, they went to war. It takes a real man's man to be a tool of empire, after all. These guys proved their manhoods against other men on the battlefield in the Civil War, the Mexican War, and the War of 1812. By the way, does anyone remember when Trump brought up Canada burning down the White House in the War of 1812 to justify tariffs that he was placing against us? I thought it was really funny because, like, everyone was saying how ridiculous that was, and they were right, but also, any Americans, if you ever get a couple drinks into a Canadian, we will absolutely start bragging about how we did that. And speaking of Canada, our Prime Minister has been going through a bit of a crisis himself. But if you're a Canadian like me, then you probably know that the government has recently passed the Canadian News Act, a law requiring Meta and Google to compensate Canadian news sources for hosting their content on their platform. Meta has responded to this by permanently banning Canadian news sources, and so I learned that Justin Trudeau is getting a divorce because of this post by fucking Popcrave. Now, a similar law was passed in Australia where Meta tried to do the same thing and eventually folded, so I'm cautiously optimistic here. That said, this whole thing has made me consider how maybe getting my news off of social media might not be the best idea, which is why I'm excited that a Canadian startup called Ground News is sponsoring today's video. So while I think that we can all agree that everyone living in a social media bubble is mostly great since it means that I'm angry just all the time, also more profits for the very cool and good people who run social media sites, plus the comments on Popcrave are actually amazing. But there is one downside, which is that everyone having a more or less shared understanding of reality is kind of important for democracy to function. Ground News has been trying to help fix this. They show news from all over the political spectrum on any topic that you care about. I really like these tags they add to show not just the political leaning of any source, but also who owns them, and it's just very useful being able to do a side-by-side comparison of each outlet's coverage of a story. With the Meta story, for example, it's really interesting seeing how, while left-wing outlets frame this as Meta flexing an unreasonable amount of power, which to be fair, I think that they are, whereas conservative outlets will tend to focus more on criticizing the law, quoting Meta's spokesperson who said that news outlets benefit more from Meta's platform than Meta does from hosting their content, which I hate to say is probably true. Like, I don't think many people open Instagram specifically to see the CBC's latest reels. That said, I don't really agree with the Conservative Party line that rather than this being an out-of-touch misunderstanding of how social media works on the part of the government and a bluff by Meta, that this was all an intentional ploy by Trudeau to get news taken off of Facebook as part of his master plan to institute in 1984, a real thing that the Conservative Party of Canada is claiming, very normal country. And so if, like me, a tug of war between your government and big tech has left you in need of a new place to get your news, or you just like a more nuanced view of what's going on in the world, then go to ground.news/we'reinhell using the link in my bio to get 30% off unlimited access to Ground News. Now, back to the video. The fourth and final way these guys dealt with the crisis of masculinity was by going to war against themselves. An extremely prominent belief back then and today was that for the self-made man, success in the market was all about self-control, which specifically came to mean control over the body and its filthy, filthy desires. And I'm not just like joking or pulling up something juicy for fun. The historian Ben Barker Benfield has even gone so far as to argue that this time period should be understood as having a, quote, spermatic economy. It genuinely can't be overstated how much Americans in the 1830s to 50s believed that male chastity was key to the success of the national economy. There was a very sincere belief that men indulging in any comforts at all, but specifically sexual ones, would lose their male energy, which should be spent on business. Whether at work or in bed, real hustlers never get off. This led to the development of a cottage industry of advice books for young men, including William Alcott's The Young Man's Guide, George Burnap's Lectures to Young Men, George Peake's The Formation of Manly Character, and Timothy Arthur's Advice to Young Men, all of which emphasized how the key to success for young men was to control their passions, while making coded references to self-pleasure, which are pretty funny to read. Like, it's all stuff like they'll be talking about how important it is to have a disciplined mind, except every once in a while, instead of mind, they'll say hand, which, like, I wish more self-help books today included creepy uncle jokes and if you know what I means. By the way, somewhere else that you can see aspects of the same moral panic today is on YouTube, which hates discussion of the physical act of love almost as much as the people I'm going to be talking about in this section. And so, in order to avoid demonetization, I too will be using euphemisms or more often just bleeping out words whenever I talk about this. So, I'm sorry about that. I know it's kind of annoying. I'll be uploading an uncensored version of my Patreon for all of you nasty freaks out there though. Anyway, yeah. Now, while all of these guys were weird as shit, two of the most successful people from this period were also the biggest freaks. One was a New England minister named John Todd, author of the best-selling book, The Student's Manual. Part of Todd's appeal was that he presented himself as representing the ideal of the self-made man. In his very self-indulgently named autobiography, John Todd, The Story of His Life Told Mainly by Himself, Todd claims to have achieved success despite having been, quote, an orphan, shelterless, penniless. Now, this is a lie. While his father did die when he was young, which is obviously very tough, Todd was raised by his mother and two aunts and seemed to have had a pretty alright childhood as a result. This image he cultivated as a self-made man did help him achieve a lot of success in life though, including becoming one of America's foremost opponents of women's rights. I feel like that maybe sheds some light onto what he said about his childhood. Like, I wasn't lying, I was an orphan, just in the sense that I don't consider women people. The other big name to come out of this was Sylvester Graham with his book A Lecture to Young Men, and this is where we get really weird. Graham was a member of the temperance movement, and so this is not an exaggeration. He believed that all physical pleasure was harmful, especially when it came to sex. And when I say harm here, I mean it very literally. Graham thought that too much pleasure led to physical illness, an idea that was being advanced by many doctors at that time too. Graham wrote that anyone who gave in to their vices would become a wretched transgressor who sinks into a miserable fatuity and finally becomes a confirmed and degraded idiot whose deeply sunken and vacant glossy eyes and livid shriveled countenance and ulcerous toothless gums and fetid breath and feeble broken voice and emaciated and dwarfish and crooked body and almost hairless head covered perhaps with suppurating blisters and running sores denote a premature old age, a blighted body and a ruined soul. Jesus Christ. So, Graham understood the body as having an internal system that he conceptualized as a market, calling it the vital economy. He believed that good health happened when the economy was kept in balance, but that all desires disturb the system, and so he believed that male bodies need to be regulated to prevent them from giving into their urges, and he had some very specific ideas of what that should involve. For one thing, Graham believed that eating the flesh of an animal led men to commit sins of the flesh, and so instead argued for a vegetarian diet consisting mostly of coarse grains. This was actually his most controversial take and led to his speeches being shut down by outraged butchers. He also thought that boys need to be doing strenuous exercise and sleep on hardwood beds in order to avoid touching anything soft or warm. Speaking of something soft and warm, Graham also argued that married couples should only have sex once a month at the very most, and that masturbation or even just fantasies were extremely dangerous and needed to be prevented by any means necessary. This included all the classics. There were like pads and chastity cages, and it's a good thing chastity cages were completely successful in preventing carnal thoughts and behaviors. It would be impossible for someone to fetishize one of those things. But also, some more creative options too. My favorites were a chastity cage that was patented around the turn of the 20th century that was hooked up to an alarm that would sound anytime the wearer got a boner. There's also a chair built by a doctor named R.J. Culverwell with the bottom cut out and a bowl of ice water below it that was attached to a pump, so the guy sitting on it could shoot that at his crotch if he got aroused. First of all, it's so funny how elaborate these are. Like, just imagining one that's like, okay, so when the guy gets a boner, his dick will knock over a series of dominoes, which will end by striking a match, which burns a string, dropping a mousetrap onto his balls. We love using Rube Goldberg machines to protect men's sexual purity, don't we, folks? I also just think it's so weird how both of those inventions are so conspicuous that they don't seem to be as much about preventing the guy from being turned on as much as they're about making his arousal the problem of everyone around him. Another notable person from this time was a physician and gynecologist named Augustus Kinsley Gardner, who was actually in some ways shockingly feminist, arguably even by today's standards, let alone the 1850s. Like, he was opposed to abortion on religious grounds, but realizing that it's done as a last resort, he argued that the only effective and moral way to prevent or reduce it was by preventing the circumstances that led women to need it in the first place, by giving them greater control over their bodies through access to contraception, sex education, economic support, and equal rights, saying that, quote, "The woman who is compelled to bear children against her will, or who is forced to submit to the sexual embrace of a man whom she does not love or who is diseased, is a slave in the worst sense of the word." Based. I just thought it was cool to highlight one of the only people I'm going to talk about in this video who had remotely good opinions. Now, allow me to burst the bubble I just blew for you by telling you what he thought about masturbation, or as he referred to it, self-murder. Gardner believed that it caused serious health problems for men and women, and therefore suggested that it be discouraged through some extremely fucked up means. It's something you see a lot at this time, where even people who are otherwise extremely progressive also hated sex. Gardner in particular had unbelievably contradictory and at times just flat out incoherent ideas about sex. Like, it's not very clear what he means by women having control of their fertility, since he also thought that condoms were unnatural and therefore wrong. He also believed that sex should be regulated to fit natural law, which for him meant only after marriage and never for pleasure. He laid out extremely specific instructions for how couples should have sex in his book, Conjugal Sins. Gardner advocated for medical interventions for people who didn't follow these very normal rules. These included using straitjackets to restrain people who masturbated, as well as making sex less pleasurable through circumcision and clitorectomies. And speaking of which, someone who would come up later around the turn of the century was John Harvey Kellogg. Kellogg ran the Battle Creek Sanitarium, which was a famous health and wellness resort attended by the rich and powerful. When it came to his treatments, there was a real anything goes vibe, where it seemed like he was really down to just throw anything at the wall and see what sticks. Like, one of his treatments was called continuous baths, which just meant what it sounds like, keeping a bunch of people in a bath for, quote, many hours, days, weeks, or months as the case may require. This was used to treat, among other things, mental health problems as well as chronic diarrhea, which that sounds like an oddball sitcom pitched by someone in the middle of the worst acid trip of all time. Okay, so there's two guys who have to overcome their differences. One of them is having a full-blown nervous breakdown, and the other can't stop shitting himself. But they learn to get along together by being forced to live in a bathtub for months. Kellogg was also, just like Gardner, a massive advocate for preventing masturbation through circumcisions and clitorectomies. He also made a point of saying that they should be done, quote, without administering an anesthetic, as the brief pain attending the operation will have a salutary effect upon the mind, especially if it be connected with the idea of punishment. Gonna be honest, not great. There are two things that I think are worth noting here, though. One is that in all this panic, you can see a shift happening where, just like how masculinity was changing from being something intrinsic into a status that could be revoked at any time, there was also a shift away from viewing moral actions as something coming from a person's soul, and instead towards viewing the body as a sort of evil machine with urges that need to be regulated and controlled. The second is that clearly everything was going a-okay and men were dealing with the crisis of masculinity just fine. But things picked up again around the turn of the 20th century. A few key things were going on at this point. For one, there was a huge increase in the urban population due to immigration and people moving from rural areas to cities in search of work. This, plus the new developments in industrialization, meant an explosion in a new class, the office worker. This was, and kind of still is, a decidedly unmanly job, which posed a big problem. While heroic artisans were long gone, previous generations of men were still at least doing something very physical at their factory jobs. The early office workers didn't even have that though. And so, feeling like they had somehow lost their manliness, they did exactly what their fathers and grandfathers had done before them, reclaiming their lost manhood by inventing a fantasy. What had changed though was that while the market men got their manhood through their labor, the business boys instead got it through what they consumed in their leisure. We can think of these masculine symbols as coming together to form a symbolic man cave that these guys could go to whenever they felt down about how they weren't getting their arms crushed in textile mills like their fathers. This is a couple different forms. In one case, when I say that this was a fantasy, I mean that very literally. Around this time, there was a big surge in adventure novels that were very popular with grown men. Authors like Jack London, Rudyard Kipling, as well as pulp stories could give these guys the feeling of danger and adventure that they felt was missing from their lives. This was made even more explicit by authors like Upton Sinclair, W.R. Burnett, and Robert Wurst, who'd use the metaphor of a jungle in their descriptions of city life. Also, what's a good man cave without an exercise machine to hang laundry on? There was a big fitness craze happening at this time. It used to be that men would get a jacked body as a result of their labor, but now sculpting your body into the shape of a real man became something you do in your leisure time. This is one of the clearest possible illustrations of a shift that was starting to happen, moving from an economy based on production to one that was based on consumption. Physical strength isn't something you get as a consequence of your labor anymore, but instead something that you buy with the fruits of it. Another more subtle change had to do with language. Previously, people would talk about manhood, but that was shifting to a new term, masculinity. The big difference was that the opposite of manhood was boyhood, whereas the opposite of masculinity is femininity. Essentially, with manhood, while your status as a man was something that you could lose, doing so meant that you weren't an adult anymore. Losing your masculinity, however, meant that you were a woman. But yeah, American masculinity became extremely health obsessed, and this didn't just mean doing 5x5 3 times a week, but also buying lots of bullshit tonics and elixirs from grifters who'd be very much at home sitting across from Joe Rogan. Some honorable mentions include Horace Fletcher, who, in his book Fletcherism, What It Is, or How I Became Young at 60, argued that the key to good health was to chew every bite of food until it becomes liquid before swallowing. Also, you're supposed to chew liquids as well, I'm not really sure why. His motto was, "Nature will castigate those who don't masticate," which admittedly is kind of catchy, and you know who'd probably agree with my assessment there? Upton Sinclair, Henry James, and John D. Rockefeller, all Fletcherites. So yeah, you now know a fucked up thing about how all of those guys ate. Do with it as you will. Something else that's interesting with Fletcher though is how this came out when people in big cities were increasingly eating faster, more convenient, and less nutritious meals. And so I think a big part of his appeal came from how he was telling people to do the polar opposite and eat excruciatingly slowly. Another huge name was Bernard McFadden, who was arguably the first fitness influencer. There's a really good episode of the podcast Behind the Bastards about him, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but he advocated for extremely heavy workouts, breathing exercises, blood purification, and for people to eat his breakfast cereal, which was hilariously named Strength Throw. He was also the proud inventor of the peniscope, which, picture a tube with one end attached to a vacuum pump, and the idea is that you're supposed to put your dick in it and then exercise it by using the pump to stretch it. Firstly, calling that an exercise is very funny. When I hear that, all I can picture is like a guy using it and then someone walks in on him and he's just like, I'm doing my stretches! Also, this is just kind of weird, but I tried to find a picture, but when I Googled it, all that came up was this one stupid cartoon. And like, when I say that, this joke has been translated into a bunch of different languages. There are shirts, or like, there's this French version that I couldn't find a date for, but it looks pretty old. Same with this German cigarette case that has it for some reason. There's also this one that's also about Pearl Harbor? I don't know what to make of it, but that is so weird, right? Like, I feel like I've uncovered a secret society. If I turn up dead, know that I am not suicidal. It was the Order of the Amazing Penis. And speaking of strength throw, some other notable manly snacks that were popular at the time were graham crackers, which, as you may have guessed, were invented by Sylvester Graham when he wasn't busy saying that sleeping in a bed is gay. And, of course, John Harvey Kellogg was also able to take some time off from mutilating children's genitals to invent cornflakes. Both of these were invented because, remember, Graham and Kellogg believed that eating meat led to lustful desires, and so they argued for a vegetarian diet based on coarse grain. I just think it's really funny that the original sales pitch for both of these products was just, spoonful of this will put you off sex for good. One thing that is nice, though, is that by the 1910s, a lot of the hysteria around masturbation was dying down, thanks largely to the work of Sigmund Freud, who said that the only real harm that came from it was the shame that people felt afterwards. Also, this is the thing with Freud, by the way. People love to go after him for how so many of his theories were wrong, which is true and that should be criticized, but also his theories start to make a bit more sense when you look at what people believed before he came around. For example, one of Freud's first big breakthroughs, and arguably what led to the creation of psychoanalysis as a field, had to do with treating what was at that time called female hysteria, which was basically a term used to describe any mental health problems a woman could have, from postpartum depression to schizophrenia. What people thought caused this, and again, by this, I mean all mental health issues in women, was called the wandering womb theory, which started in ancient Greece and is basically what you think it is. They thought that the womb could move around the body, which would fuck with a woman's mind, and they thought that this was caused by a woman's vagina being too stinky. And so early treatments were to lure the womb back to its normal position with perfumes and incense. Like, just imagining a woman having a panic attack and the treatment is for them to pull out a fan and a scented candle. But actually, it is genuinely terrifying how influential this theory has been. Like, I'm talking about thousands of years worth of mental health treatments for women were inspired by this until around the turn of the 20th century. And then Freud came through and was like, whoa, 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 whoa. What if we just talk to them? And so, yeah, like, feel free to still go off on Freud if you want to, but I'm just saying that he doesn't seem nearly as weird when you realize what he was replacing. And speaking of Freud, everyone knows that the theme of any good man cave, needs to be sports. And Americans at the turn of the 20th century went hard on them, both playing and watching. When it came to playing, a big part was that since being a man had gone from being an intrinsic fact about someone in the pre-industrial era to now being something that's decided by other men, it needs to be regularly proven, and sports are a really convenient way of doing that. Also, there was and still is a very big emphasis on how playing sports instills manly virtues into boys, and that's definitely not bullshit. While they aren't the only way to do this, sports do teach kids of any gender a lot of really valuable skills, like working as a team, winning gracefully, overcoming defeat, practicing to achieve a long-term goal, and hitting a ball really hard in order to make it move far away. That said, while I'm in no way trying to cancel the great game that is sports ball, I think that it's worth pointing out how there are other ways to instill those lessons into kids. And so, why is there so much emphasis placed on sports, particularly for boys? And I think that the answer might be because sports also teach deference to authority and physical aggression, which, while those aren't inherently bad, they do make sports particularly useful if your goal is to create the types of boys who will grow up to be obedient workers and violent soldiers. When it came to watching sports, though, that served a different role. While baseball was by far the most popular sport at the turn of the 20th century, I'm more interested in another one that at the time was just taking root but spreading quickly: boxing. There's kind of a cliche argument that fits pretty well here about how watching fights is a way for guys to safely get out their aggression, and I think that there is for sure some truth to that, but also I try and stay away from arguments like that. I'm not here to give you the same takes as your aunt who thinks she's better than you because she reads Jonathan Franzen. I just implied that sports are fascist. I'm fucking crazy. I'm here to give you weird takes. Takes that if you actually think about them for a little while are kind of a stretch a lot of the time. You don't know what I'm gonna say or how I'm gonna tie it to neoliberalism. No, so I think that sports serve as a way for men to vicariously access that lost figure of the heroic artisan. Sorry, I shouldn't have hyped that up so much. I realized it was pretty anticlimactic. Athletes are able to embody this old masculine ideal of a master craftsman able to support himself with nothing but his skilled hands and free to apply his trade wherever and however he chooses. I think that this is true to some extent with all sports, but especially with fighting ones, in part because they don't have teams, and also because, they're fights. You really see this in present-day wrestling, where so much of it is about enacting this fantasy of a blue-collar worker telling their boss to eat shit. I'm probably reading into things a bit too much here, but I really do think that a big part of the appeal of professional athletes is the fact that they're some of the last remaining people who became successful by working with their bodies and not having a boss. Whatever the case though, boxers definitely came to represent an ideal of masculinity, both back then and today. Take for instance the man who's generally credited with turning boxing into a legitimate sport as both the last bare-knuckle heavyweight champion and first gloved heavyweight champion, John L. Sullivan. The son of Irish immigrants coming from a working class background, Sullivan became the first boxing superstar, seen as the ultimate self-made working class ideal of a man. So much so that even if you've never heard of him before, you've definitely seen this picture of him. Now, anyone who's at all familiar with the history of boxing, though, is going to be shocked to hear this, but there was also a racial dimension to all of this. Ugh. Classic liberal snowflakes trying to make Muhammad Ali political. So now, let's compare John L. Sullivan to the second superstar boxer, Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight champion and a ridiculously cool person. While Sullivan had a modest working class upbringing, Johnson grew up poor. And whereas Sullivan got his start in illegal bare-knuckle fights, Johnson started out doing what were called battle royales, which you can tell this is going to be messed up when even the polite name for them still sounds really bad. Battle royales were events where a bunch of black men would be put in a ring and made to have a free-for-all fight while blindfolded for an audience of rich white freaks. But after winning a number of these, Johnson moved on to actual boxing matches, which he was amazing at, and 5 years in, he was crowned the world-colored heavyweight champion in 1903. At that time, white boxers refused to compete against black athletes, but rather than stopping there, Johnson spent the next 5 years trying to get a chance to compete for the title of world heavyweight champion. Initially, he challenged the reigning champion Jim Jeffries in 1905, who responded by saying that he would retire from boxing, quote, when there are no more white men left to fight. Which, first of all, I like how differently that quote would read if his job had been anything other than a boxer. Just like, how much longer am I going to be a pilot for? I'll hang up my stripes when there are no more white men left to fight. Anyways, apparently there really were no more white men left to fight, because soon after saying that, Jeffries retired from the sport undefeated. He was replaced by Tommy Burns, who Johnson then spent the next 3 years literally following him around the world, taunting him into agreeing to a fight. Like, Burns was showing up to a fight in Paris, and Johnson's there, just like, pouvez-vous intéresser me punching your fucking lights out? In 1908, Burns finally agreed and promptly got his shit rocked so badly that the cops ended the fight, and Johnson became the first ever black heavyweight champion.
At this very moment, in the early seconds of round 14, the police shut off the motion picture cameras and stepped into the ring, awarding the heavyweight championship of the world to Jack Johnson.
White people were predictably not okay with this and began searching for someone who could be the great white hope to retake the crown from Johnson. And in 1910, that title was given to Jeffries, who, despite not having fought in 5 years, came out of retirement saying that, quote, "I am going into this fight for the sole purpose of proving that a white man is better than a Negro." This didn't go well. The fight lasted 15 rounds. Jeffries started strong and won the first round. Then Johnson took the second and the third, but Jeffries made a comeback, winning the fourth, and then spent the next 11 rounds getting his ass handed to him. It ended with Johnson knocking Jeffries to the ground, something that no one had ever done before. He then punched Jeffries through the ropes. His team helped him get back into the ring, which they're not allowed to do, but this just allowed Johnson to keep on wailing on Jeffries until his team threw in the towel just in time to prevent a knockout. Johnson's win caused white people to riot in cities across America, killing at least 20 people and injuring hundreds. Johnson was vilified in the press and eventually charged for the crime of transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes because he had traveled with his white wife, and the footage of his match with Jeffries was repressed. John L. Sullivan, on the other hand, first became a meme in 2012, literally called Overly Manly Man, when a picture of him was posted to Our Advice Animals with this caption. Pretty weak, if I'm being honest. I mean, come on, colors? You mean the group of people I'm too racist to compete against was right there. To be fair, by the standards of his time, Sullivan wasn't bad at all about race. A lot of historians think that he sparred with black boxers but lied, claiming he hadn't for the sake of his career. He also knew Johnson and was one of the very few white people who acknowledged that he deserved the title. That's still not great in my opinion, but the bar is in hell. While Sullivan came to represent an ideal of manliness, which has continued to this very day, Johnson represented all the white working class's fears of being supplanted by newly freed black people. These kinds of racial fears also came up with regards to the sexual panics, but I think that there was a slightly different character to them then. Reading how dangerous and depraved the people thought that non-white people were, while also realizing that the people making those claims may well have been doing so while wearing a chastity cage that had a boner alarm, you get the feeling that there was probably some projection going on. But while the gym, sports, and fiction may have helped things, people were still worried that something was deeply wrong with men. A new insult was appearing at the time, and for a lot of men, being called it was their greatest fear. The word was sissy. First of all, imagine how great your life would have to be if that was your biggest fear, but there were news articles calling out the danger that the prevalence of sissies posed to the country, while Alfred Steele, the founder and president of the American Medical Association, wrote that, quote, "A man with feminine traits of character, or with the frame and carriage of a female, is despised by both the sex he ostensibly belongs to and that of which he is at once a caricature and a libel." But it's probably not a coincidence, though, that the term appeared right around when everyone was moving to cities, since something that big cities tend to have is a gay culture. A lot of people in America were seeing gay guys for, as far as they knew, the first time, and a stereotype of gay men was one that lined up with some of their worst fears of sissies. This, Kimmel has argued, led to homophobia and a general rejection of all things feminine becoming a core part of masculinity. But everyone was trying to figure out what was causing this feminization of America. Some people blamed the modern corporate world for being too stressful and demanding based. Others thought that the problem was just cities as a whole. Also, this was around when the first big waves of non-English speaking immigrants came to America, and so a lot of people blamed them. But the explanation that most people landed on, though, was schools. The theory went that since the rise of market masculinity, men now spent all their time out of the house, leaving their children to be raised by their mothers. Now, by the turn of the 20th century, as schools became more and more secular, the vast majority of teachers were women. How could these boys become manly if they were being raised by women? Again, I'm not talking about vague cultural trends here. This was considered a serious problem to the point where a team of British psychologists were sent to America in 1904 to observe the American education system in order to avoid a similar thing happening there. The psychologists wrote, "The boy in America is not being brought up to punch another boy's head, or to stand having his own punched in an healthy and proper manner. Also, I can't do a British accent to save my life." Just imagining this guy getting home to England, he steps in the door and just immediately gets punched in the jaw, and it's just like, oh, thank God I'm home. Also, while some of the things I've talked about so far are pretty similar to what modern day grifters will say, we are now at the point in the video where, like, these are talking points that are used today.
Most kids who go to school, most teachers are women. Most teachers are not men.
We teach our boys to be defective girls. So you got a 5-year-old boy who's primary, he knows no other way of teaching except for the women that have been teaching him since the time he was born.
But as psychology came into its own around this time, they started worrying about something new. There was this idea that was coming up that the problem with men and society as a whole was that modern society was just working us all too hard and using people up. Two men, George Beard and Dr. S. Weir Mitchell, introduced this new mental illness, neurothesia, or as it was popularly called, brain strain, essentially exhaustion. This honestly doesn't sound that weird, right? Like, they may have even been onto something. Well, here's the thing. The main symptom of neurasthenia was that it inverted the genders, causing men to act feminine and women to act masculine. The treatment then was for patients to act more stereotypically in line with the gender that they were assigned at birth, which, let's just say that there were some mixed reviews. For women, that meant regaining their lost femininity through a treatment called rest cure, which is a very nice term for what was basically torture. The writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman was treated for this. She wrote that her doctor told her to, quote, "Live as domestic a life as possible. Have your child with you all the time. Lie down an hour after each meal. Have but 2 hours intellectual life a day, and never touch pen, brush, or pencil as long as you live." If you've ever read the short story Yellow Wallpaper, yeah, this is what that's about. For men, though, the treatment was very different. For them to regain their masculinity, they'd often be sent to a dude ranch, which is basically just a failed cattle ranch that was converted into a spa for men, where they'd just go and play cowboy for a week or so. Honestly, sounds fun. The great outdoors in general became extremely important at this time. The American West had by this point been tamed and was now being turned into a combination amusement park and museum for feminized Eastern pencil pushers from the big city to come and reclaim their lost manhoods. Most notable of these was Theodore Roosevelt. Hunting had a huge resurgence, coincidentally, right around this time when modern slaughterhouses made the act of hunting completely unnecessary for the average person to do. Roosevelt founded the Boone and Crockett Club along with George Bird Grinnell, who wrote that hunting big game in the wilderness is a sport for vigorous and masterful people. A California congressman named William Kent also said that after a kill, "You are a barbarian and you're glad of it. It's good to be a barbarian, and you know that if you are a barbarian, you are at any rate a man." What can I say but dudes rock? The view of meat also flipped at this time. Now it was essential to eat it in order to be a man. A big part of this came from the belief that people received the characteristics of the food that they ate, like eating muscle would give you more muscles and eating blood would give you more blood. We can see the consequences, though, of meat, especially red meat, being masculine in present-day vendors of masculinity like Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan. Now, I'm going to start wrapping up here as we get into the modern era, but before we do, let's talk a little bit about the role of women. While men would be off at work stressing about how their office jobs made them less of a man, their wives would be taking care of the children and the home, and what the latter involved was a lot of shopping. A part of what was considered women's work that I don't often see discussed was making most of the purchasing decisions for the home. Men would generally be the decision makers for big purchases like a house or a car, but for all the little things, groceries, cleaning products, toiletries, all those little things that tend to be more of a chore than anything, that was all women. This stopped being just a chore in the mid-1800s, though, with the creation of department stores, which turned shopping into a social activity for women. And this kind of worked for around 100 years or so. But then, during the late 20th century, things started to change. Women were now becoming a large part of the workforce. People were getting married later in life. There was a decline in the traditional nuclear family and the spread of radical feminist ideas, like men doing some of the housework. And this was all starting to present a problem for these companies. See, men weren't at this time very good consumers, and in fact were deeply hostile to that changing in any way, which was a pretty big problem as the American economy was now reorienting towards being one that was based off of consumption as manufacturing jobs were shipped overseas. There's a fucking fly in here right now, and filming this has literally turned into that episode of Breaking Bad that everyone hates. You know how in so much media from the 90s, the male protagonist will talk about how consumerist and fake society has become?
There is an idea of a Patrick Bateman, some kind of abstraction, but there is no real me.
I felt sorry for guys packed into gyms, trying to look like how Calvin Klein or Tommy Hilfiger said they should. Is that what a man looks like?
Well, I don't disagree with that take at all. Something that's always weird about it is how they'll usually tie that in some way into how this is somehow feminizing men. The reason why they bring that up, and I'd imagine part of why they hate consumerism so much in general, is because until that point, consumption was women's work. And in order to fix this issue, a lot of very powerful corporations conspired to reshape masculinity, turning it into a set of products to be bought. In my next video, which should be out in around 2 weeks, subscribe and hit the bell if you want to make sure you don't miss it, I'll be talking about how they did this, what the new man they created was like, and how the backlash to all of this failed to decommodify masculinity, but instead led to the rise of the worst men on the internet today. Thanks for watching.